Welcome back to Introduction to Talmudic Legal Logic. And in today's lecture, we'll talk about how the Talmud sees and interprets the Torah, the biblical text. Those of you familiar with the US legal structure probably know of a constitutional clause called the Supremacy Clause. What the Supremacy Clause does is create an ordering or a hierarchy of the various legal statutory provisions in the United States, which basically regulates what happens in case one system of laws happens to contradict another. At the very top of the pyramid is the US Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. And under it, you can find acts of Congress and treaties, then state constitutions, then state statutes, and then city and county charters and ordinances. Meaning that if, for example, there's a state statute or even an act of Congress that contradicts the US Constitution, that law is going to be declared void. Or it might be interpreted to harmonize with the Constitution, but if there's no harmonization possible, that law is going to have to go because the Constitution wins, it's higher up in the hierarchy. Rabbinics also have sort of a supremacy clause. It starts off at the very top of the pyramid with the Torah. And here, depending on who you talk to, you might be talking to the written Torah, so the biblical text itself as written, or a combination of written Torah with oral Torah, with some things that come hand in hand with the written source. Below the Torah are the materials from the Tannaitic period, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the Baraita. We have the Mishnah and we have the Tosefta, but many of the Baraitot that are mentioned in the Talmud cannot be found. And it's possible that some of them have been faked for authority claims. But anyway, the Mishnah is basically an interpretation of the Torah, and it cannot contradict the Torah. The materials in the Gemara, the Amoraic materials, are an interpretation of the Mishnah. We've already seen that the Talmudic stage starts off with the Mishnah and then proceeds to arguments and interpretations about the Mishnaic text. So as you can see, if an Amoraic text is interpreting a Mishnah, it can't contradict the Mishnah. It can also just accept it as given. It also cannot contradict, of course, the Torah. So there's a supremacy clause in rabbinic materials as well. So how do these Amoraic materials approach the Torah, or what do they think about the text? There's a wonderful book by James Kugel called The Bible as It Was, and he looks at four basic assumptions that characterize rabbinic interpretation. The first thing that he says is that the Bible is a fundamentally cryptic text, which is open to interpretation in many layers, right? There's all kinds of things that you can do with a biblical text. He also says that there is no early and late in the Torah. The Torah speaks to everyone outside of time and place. So wherever you open the book, you're going to find something that is relevant. It's not something that's frozen in a historical or geographic context. It's relevant to pretty much everything. Moreover, and relatedly, the text is harmonious and homogeneous, meaning that there are no contradictions. If there are places in which the biblical text appears to self-contradict, there has to be some explanation that harmonizes both of them. Because, and here's where we get to the fourth assumption, the text is divine, and therefore it cannot possibly have any mistakes or problems in it. Any apparent contradiction or difficulty has to be intentional. We just have to dig deep to get to the bottom of it and figure out how to harmonize the contradiction or resolve the difficulty. So this is the approach to the Bible, and you can see, of course, that this means that the text is being regarded as sacred. Sometimes people think about this the same way that legal interpreters think about the originalist approach to the US Constitution. Some of you might know that originalism, which was closely associated with Justice Scalia for many, many years and is now associated with some of the people who are continuing his path, is all about interpreting the US constitutional text the way that it existed when the framers approached it, meaning that the Constitution has an a priori meaning prior to the judicial interpretation of it. If you change the meaning of a law, you're actually changing the law. What you want to capture when you interpret the Constitution is its utterance meaning, right? Kind of like what the Constitution intended to say, and that is binding, right? Basically, what originalists do is they try to figure out what would have been the intent behind this particular constitutional clause back when the framers conceived of it. As you can see, even though we sometimes colloquially say that originalists are sanctifying the Constitution in some way, it's not the same thing as interpreting Torah in rabbinic sources. Because the Torah is actually not approached in the context of a time and a place. It's interpreted out of time and out of place. The classic saying about different interpretations of the Torah is called pardes. Pardes is the Hebrew name for an orchard. There's a story of four wise men who went into a pardes, into an orchard. One of them went mad, one of them died. Basically, only one of them came out of the experience intact. This story is taken to be an allegory to the four approaches to interpreting the Bible, which are the acronym of Pardes, PRDS, Peshat, Remez, Drash, Vesod. All of these approaches can serve to excavate the meaning of the Bible and rely on biblical passages to explain complicated laws and regulations. Let's take each of them in turn. Peshat, from the word pashut, simple, is basically reading the text as it is on its face. The assumption of a Peshat interpretation is that the Bible speaks in the language of people. It's telling you a plain story. There is a lot to get from the story as it is on its face. This kind of approach will set a lot of store by the storytelling of the Bible. It'll look at the narrative, it'll look at the context, it'll look at character development, and it'll basically tell you a story that's very close to just basically a retelling of how the Bible tells the story. That in itself is already pretty deep. We can't confuse this with a shallow approach to the Bible because it does require some fine literary insights about what are the people doing, why are they behaving in a certain way, what's making them tick, that sort of thing. And digging into that is a Peshat approach to the Bible. There's also remez, or hint, and this is referring to the stories in the Bible as you would to a parable or to an allegory, right? So if somebody's telling you a story that happens between two people, you might see it as an allegory of a story that happens between two nations or between two forces of nature or something like that, with the people symbolizing those nations or forces of nature. Another approach that we're going to talk about a little bit more is drash, and another one is sod. And before we explain those, let's take a look at an interesting text from a midrashic text called Shir HaShirim Rabbah. This is a midrash text on the Song of Songs. The story goes as follows. Ben Azai, who is a wise man, one of the rabbis, was sitting and studying, and fire surrounded him. They went and told Rabbi Akiva, Ben Azai is sitting and studying, and fire is burning around him. Rabbi Akiva went to Ben Azai and said to him, I heard that you were studying and that the fire was burning around you. He said, Yes. He said, Perhaps you were studying the mystical text of Merkavah? He said, No. Rather, I was stringing beads of Torah, from Torah to prophets, and from prophets to writings, and things were as happy as when they were given in Sinai, and they were as pleasant as when they were given, and also when given at Sinai, were they not given through fire? It is as it is written, and the mountain burned. What the story is doing is it's telling us something about the interpretive work that Ben Azai is doing and how that interpretive work is mirroring or reflecting the situation described in Deuteronomy in which the Torah was given to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. On its face, the text that describes the Sinaitic revelation says that the mountain was on fire, from which we deduce that it's, a very awesome and fantastic apparition of God giving the sacred text to the sacred people. But here there's something else going on. There's the implication that the text wasn't just given once in Sinai, but rather that you can replicate the experience of receiving the text again and again and again by doing creative things, by beating texts together, by putting them together in new combinations, by putting together creative necklaces that build on sources from here and from there and from all over the text. right? This is one way, at least, to read this Ben Azai story, which brings me to explain what a drash is. This story in Shir Shirim Rabbah is usually invoked to explain, in some ways, the beauty of the literary form known as midrash. Midrash or drash is a creative or intertextual approach to biblical text. In conforming with the principles that James Kugel elucidated, the idea is that any section of the Bible, any phrase from the Bible, any word or even letter from the Bible can be used to illuminate other biblical texts because there is always harmony, because there are always interrelations, and because there is no early, there is no late, there is no time and place. Essentially, the interpretive dimensions that sprout all this creativity, this is the thinking, are already encompassed in the text. And this is how this differs from originalism. Because what the exegete is doing is merely illuminating what is already there, rather than sort of inventing things that are not part of the Torah. Because the Torah is multidimensional and it's already enfolding, encircling all of these various meanings that we're going to discover through these intertextual relations. There is another wrinkle to the Ben Azai story. If you recall, Rabbi Akiva said to Ben Azai, weren't you studying mystical texts which you're not supposed to? This alludes to the fourth method of biblical interpretation, known as sod. And the idea here is that the Bible also has mystical and secret meanings. There's a whole branch of literature on Jewish mysticism from centuries ago, all of which involves a lot of metaphor, a lot of illusion, a lot of things that can't really be captured with the senses. And the Mishnah and the Talmud urge that people exercise special care and caution when learning biblical sources in this way. In fact, Mishnah Chagiga warns that you should not study incest before three or more individuals, probably to ensure that people are not, making a joke out of very serious matters, nor may one expound the act of creation before two or more individuals, because this again is something that requires maybe careful talking and, not having people mislead you. And then it says, nor may one expound by oneself the design of the divine chariot, Merkava. Merkava is a mystical teaching that has to do with the ways that God deals with the world, conducts the world, all of that. The idea is you have to be somebody who is very trustworthy and very experienced in the way of sods to dig into this kind of material, into the Merkava material, for somebody who understands the matters on his own. Rather, if you want to dig into Merkava, you have to have very, very careful guidance. This is dangerous stuff. It requires caution unless you're very sure that you know what you're doing. Let's go back a little bit to the drash, and I want to show you something interesting. So this diagram comes from the Sefaria visualization function. And basically what it does is every little line here is illustrating a situation in which the Talmud, which is in the bottom row, is citing or mentioning or referring to a particular section in the Bible. And as you're going to see, there is no early and late. Every section of the Talmud has references from all over the Bible. They might get something from Genesis or from the legal codices in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. They might get some poetic language from the Psalms. They might get something from the prophecies. They're going to learn something from everything. Here's another example for you. This is biblical referencing pertaining to Tractate Sanhedrin only. One thing that you can see is that there is a lot of reliance here on the texts in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, in Genesis, Exodus, and especially Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which contain a lot of legal material. Because Tractate Sanhedrin deals with courts, with witnesses, with punishments, with legal matters, oftentimes it's going to rely on these texts, which have a lot of rules, in a Peshat manner, just because those are laws and these are laws, and you're going to cite laws when we're talking about laws. But as you can see, even though our topic is courts and punishments and all kinds of things like that, nevertheless, the examples, the allusions, the illustrations, all the intertextual creativity is going to come from all over the codex, including prophets, including writings. I want to show you one more of these, and this is biblical referencing, but this time we're only looking at one Talmudic tractate. We're looking at Bava Metzia, which is a tractate that deals for the most part, again, with legal matters that involve interpersonal conflicts, what today we would call contract law and tort law. right? Again, you can see that there's a lot of heavy referencing of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, some of Exodus. That's because a lot of these laws that are being elucidated in Bava Metzia come from these biblical codexes. But as you can see, even in this very matter-of-factly useful legal analysis, we still have references all over the biblical codex. And this tells you something about the fact that what they're using in Bava Metzia to interpret the Bible is not just Peshat. They're not just looking at the laws as they are, they're also using Drash because all the codex is open to them. There is no early and late, there is nothing that gets excluded, and everything is related to everything.